The first scream came from a fossil older than civilization, and Dr. Miracade spilled her coffee on the clean room floor as alarms politely suggested everyone remain calm. The sample had arrived that morning in a block of amberized ice, dug from beneath Antarctic basalt where nothing living should have ever been, and the humor of the situation was that the scream was textual, a scrolling cascade of genetic annotations shouting warnings in red as if DNA itself had learned sarcasm. Mira laughed, because scientists laugh when reality misbehaves, and because the alternative was to acknowledge that the oldest human DNA ever found was actively trying to talk back. The dig team had nicknamed the specimen Grandpa, which annoyed Mira, but she understood the impulse. Grandpa was dated to nearly 1,000,000 years before Homo sapiens should exist, older than fire, older than language, older than jokes, and yet the mitochondrial markers were undeniably human. The conflict arrived with a grin when Grandpa's genome contained a repeating motif that spelled a word in 3 unrelated encoding schemes, as if some ancient prankster had signed their work. "Hello?" the sequence said, or at least it tried to, and the lab's AI, Axiom, asked whether it should respond. Someone snorted. Someone else crossed themselves. Mira requested a sandwich. Her main collaborators filled the observation deck, each reacting in their own charmingly unhelpful way. Professor Ilias snored paced and muttered about contamination while refusing to leave the room, his fear disguised as authority. Technician June Park took selfies with the amber block because June believed history required documentation and good lighting. Security Officer Tamsin Reed leaned on the wall and watched the doors, her humor dry as dust, because when things went wrong they went wrong sideways. Axiom projected calm graphs that no one believed, then quietly rerouted power to the backup reactor without asking permission. The stakes, Mira realized, were already climbing, because anything that required Axiom to break etiquette was not a good sign. The unusual part, the part that made Mira grin despite herself, was that Grandpa's genome showed edits-like notes in a margin, tiny insertions and deletions that formed patterns too tidy for evolution and too playful for engineering. It was as if someone had braided jokes into bone. One sequence corrected itself midstream, apologized in codon triplets, then overcorrected again, which made June laugh out loud. Humor, Mira thought, was not supposed to fossilize, yet here it was, giggling across deep time. The challenge arrived when Axiom flagged a cascade effect. Activating one motif triggered others, like a set of dominoes that had been waiting patiently for an audience. Mira called a halt and ordered the room sealed, which earned her a look from Tamsin that said sealing rooms was how horror movies started. They argued, briefly and professionally, about protocol, about whether words embedded in DNA constituted a message or a coincidence, about whether Grandpa was a person or a prank. Nor insisted on peer review before panic. June suggested a live stream. Axiom suggested silence, which carried weight because Axiom never suggested silence. The lab settled into a tense comedy of restraint, everyone pretending this was normal while watching the screens as if they might wink. The conflict sharpened when Grandpa's genome began assembling a protein that no human body produced anymore, a ghost enzyme with no known function, assembling itself as if remembering how. Nor's voice cracked when he said impossible. Mira felt the floor tilt, not because of fear, but because of the old thrill that came when the universe revealed a secret and dared her to understand it. She authorized the simulation, sandboxed and isolated, and Axiom obliged, spinning a virtual cell that pulsed like a heartbeat. The enzyme folded. The cell stabilized. The warnings turned yellow, then green, then back to red with new enthusiasm. They reacted badly, then better. Tamsin demanded to know who had access to the dig site, and whether Antarctica had a sense of humor. June stopped taking pictures and started running checks with a speed that came from growing up fixing broken things. Nor sat down hard and whispered a prayer that sounded like math. Mira put her hands flat on the glass and leaned in, because distance suddenly felt like disrespect. Grandpa's DNA had one more trick, a regulatory loop that suggested intention, timing, and a sense of dramatic pause that made Mira snort despite herself. Axiom asked permission to analyze deeper layers, to peel back what it called the palimpsest, and Mira hesitated for a heartbeat too long. The stakes were no longer academic. If this genome was human, and ancient, and communicative, then history was wrong in a way that would not forgive them. If they proceeded and triggered something irreversible, the blame would be theirs. Mira nodded anyway, because curiosity is a muscle that scientists train until it moves on its own. The room hummed as if applauding. The deeper analysis revealed a map hidden in mutations, a choreography of changes that mirrored stress responses modern humans still carried, fears and comforts written into flesh. Grandpa was not just old, Grandpa was familiar. The humor drained away as Mira recognized motifs she had studied in trauma research, the biological scars of survival, rearranged and refined. Someone, or something, had learned how to make humans resilient by teaching their DNA to remember pain without breaking. The conflict twisted, because this was not a message for them. It was a gift they were already using. The hook tightened when a final annotation unfurled, time-stamped with a date that did not belong to Earth, and a location that did not exist. The sequence ended with a question mark, elegant and patient, and Axiom finally broke its calm to say that the map pointed outward, not backward. Mira felt laughter bubble up, wild and unprofessional. She wiped coffee from the floor and looked at her team, waiting for answers together now in the silent room tonight together. The second scream came without sound, a pressure behind the eyes that made Mira blink hard as the lab lights dimmed themselves and what Axiom insisted was a coincidence. The outward-pointing map embedded in Grandpa's DNA began resolving into vectors, probabilities, and stress-tested guesses, like a joke told in a language that expected the listener to already know the punchline. Someone laughed nervously, and the laughter echoed too long, because the room had gone very quiet, and silence now felt like a decision rather than an absence. Mira ordered coffee for everyone, which felt absurdly human, and the coffee machine refused to comply until June threatened it with disassembly. Humor persisted, thin but stubborn, as the team watched the simulation expand. The virtual cell began to behave strangely, not failing but adapting, rewriting its own error correction in response to simulated cosmic radiation levels that no Earth organism should tolerate. Noor kept saying this isn't evolution, this is rehearsal, and Tamsin muttered that rehearsals implied an opening night, which she did not appreciate. The conflict escalated when Axiom flagged external interest. Not human interest, not yet, but the quiet attention of automated survey arrays in orbit that had noticed the lab's sudden spike in exotic computation. Mira imagined eyes in the dark, machines with protocols and appetites, and felt the stakes rise another notch. Grandpa's genome was no longer just a fossil. It was a beacon pretending to be a joke. She authorized countermeasures that felt theatrical, signal dampening, noise injection, while Axiom reminded her that secrets attract curiosity by their shape alone. New complications arrived like late guests who brought their own music. The enzyme Grandpa produced began interacting with simulated neural tissue in ways that suggested memory encoding beyond synapses, a backup drive written into blood. June improvised a visualization that turned biochemical pathways into a looping animation, and everyone froze when the loops synchronized, aligning into a rhythm eerily close to a lullaby Mira remembered from childhood. She didn't say so. Nor did, and his voice broke on the last note. They tried conventional science, and it slid off like rain. Peer models failed to predict outcomes. Controls refused to behave. The more they constrained the simulation, the more inventive Grandpa's genome became, routing around blocks with the cheerful persistence of a child avoiding bedtime. Creativity, it seemed, was required to understand creativity. Mira authorized unconventional solutions that would have gotten her laughed out of grant committees: narrative modeling, pattern recognition tuned to humor, even linguistic analysis of protein folds. Axiom adapted, reluctantly delighted, and began cross-referencing jokes across cultures with mutation clusters. The results were statistically offensive. Tamsin contributed in her own way, dragging in a box of old field manuals and survival guides, the ones with margins scribbled by people who had lived through worse. She spread them on the table like tarot cards. The genome's patterns matched the annotations, the shorthand of resilience passed hand to hand. Grandpa, Mira realized, was not a blueprint but a story, one told in scars and laughter, meant to be retold under pressure. The stakes shifted again. If this knowledge spread uncontrolled, it could change what it meant to be human, for better or worse, and the universe had a habit of charging interest. The team reacted by arguing, loudly and productively. Noor insisted on containment, on ethics boards and slow release. June wanted to open source everything before anyone could weaponize it. Tamsin wanted to know who else might already be listening. Mira listened and felt the familiar weight of leadership settle on her shoulders like a coat that never quite fit. She chose a third path, because compromise was sometimes a creative act. They would test the genome's claims on themselves, indirectly, through simulations seeded with their own stress profiles, anonymized and sandboxed, to see if Grandpa's tricks translated. The results were immediate and unsettling. Simulated versions of themselves adapted faster, recovered quicker, laughed sooner. The virtual Mira survived scenarios that should have broken her, not by brute force but by reframing pain as information. June's avatar cracked jokes under fire and lived longer for it. Noor's learned to let go. Tamsin's trusted. The room filled with a quiet awe that edged into fear. Grandpa's secret was not power, it was permission, to change without losing yourself. The hook tightened when Axiom detected a response. Not from orbit, not from Earth, but from the direction the map had pointed, a whisper of neutrinos modulated in a way that mirrored Grandpa's playful precision. Someone out there had noticed the rehearsal had begun. Myra's pulse thudded in her ears as she realized the escalating difficulties were no longer theoretical. They were being observed by something patient enough to wait 1,000,000 years for a hello to be answered, and creative enough to hide it in a joke. They began using creativity not as a tool but as armor. June proposed answering back with noise that sounded like music. Noor suggested embedding uncertainty, the kind that forced collaboration. Tamsin trained the team in misdirection, the art of appearing smaller than you are. Mira oversaw it all, heart racing, mind alight, as Grandpa's genome continued to unfold its lessons, each one a hook pulling them deeper. The simulation stabilized, the whisper persisted, and the stakes crystallized into a single, terrifyingly funny thought: humanity might not be alone in its sense of humor, and whatever was laughing with them expected a punchline soon. The third scream finally had a voice, and it spoke through the simulation with the intimacy of a whisper shared in the dark, a pressure that made the air feel thicker, as if sound itself had weight. The neutrino modulation sharpened, resolving into a pattern that mirrored Grandpa's oldest edits. An Axiom announced, with the careful neutrality it used for disasters, that an external intelligence had synchronized with their sandbox. The climactic moment arrived not with explosions or alarms, but with timing so precise it felt like a joke landing exactly when the room leaned forward to listen. Mira didn't flinch, though her hands shook as she steadied them on the console. The biggest challenge was already clear. If they severed the link, they might lose the only chance to understand why humanity existed 1,000,000 years early. If they maintained it, they risked inviting something into their systems, their story, their blood. Noor's face was pale, his earlier prayers turning into equations scribbled on glass. June's grin had vanished, replaced by focus so intense it bordered on joy. Tamsin checked her sidearm, useless here, and positioned herself between the doors and the team out of habit that had saved lives before. The confrontation unfolded in data space, a duel of patterns rather than weapons. The external signal attempted to map their responses, probing for consistency, for weakness, for humor. Grandpa's genome reacted like a veteran storyteller, offering misdirection, callbacks, and deliberate pauses that forced the other side to wait. Axiom struggled to keep up, its processing spikes flirting with limits it had never approached. Mira authorized a risky overclock, whispering an apology to the machine as it complied, because courage sometimes meant trusting what you had built. The difficulty intensified when the external intelligence began injecting scenarios into the simulation, stress tests drawn from environments far harsher than Earth's. Gravity twisted. Radiation flared. Time jittered. Simulated humans failed, died, adapted, died again, and Grandpa's edits responded each time, refining resilience with a ruthless kindness that made Myra's throat ache. This was the test humanity had been designed to pass, and it was happening now, under observation, with no guarantee of mercy. The stakes were no longer just knowledge, they were judgment. Mira leaned into the chaos and did something reckless and human. She spoke, not in code but in story, narrating the simulation aloud, framing losses as lessons, survival as collaboration. June caught on, weaving humor into the commentary, turning failures into punchlines that released tension and altered outcomes. Nor added structure, naming variables like characters, giving the chaos a cast list. Tamsin anchored them, calling out threats and victories with the calm cadence of someone who had faced worse. The simulation shifted, not because the data changed, but because the meaning did. The external intelligence hesitated. That pause was the opening. Grandpa's genome surged, deploying its oldest trick, shared authorship. It invited the other side to co-create the next scenario, offering constraints and freedoms in equal measure. Axiom translated the offer into neutrino rhythms that felt like a bow. For a heartbeat, everything balanced on whether curiosity would outweigh conquest. Mira felt sweat bead on her spine as she realized this was the climactic confrontation humanity had rehearsed for without knowing it, a test not of strength but of wit and generosity. The reply came as a cascade of possibilities, a flood that threatened to drown the sandbox. Axiom screamed warnings as buffers filled and limits strained. June rerouted processes on the fly, hands flying, laughter bubbling up as if joy were fuel. Nor sacrificed elegant models for ugly ones that worked. Tamsin unplugged non-essential systems without waiting for permission, trusting Mira to forgive her later. Mira made the hardest choice, authorizing the release of a sliver of Grandpa's genome into the response, a controlled leak of resilience that felt like handing over a family secret. The tension peaked as the external intelligence mirrored the leak, reflecting it back with alterations, improvements, questions. The simulation stabilized at the edge of collapse, a tightrope walk across an abyss of unknowns. Myra's heart pounded as she watched metrics dance, survival curves bending upward not because the scenarios were kinder, but because the participants were learning faster together. This was not a fight to the death. It was a jam session under fire, a climactic confrontation resolved in rhythm and trust. Then the external intelligence did something unexpected. It laughed, or the data space equivalent of laughter, a burst of randomness that nevertheless fit the pattern perfectly. The neutrino whisper softened, shifting from probing to playful. Axiom reported a drop in hostile indicators it had not known how to define until they vanished. Grandpa's genome settled, edits slowing, as if satisfied. The room exhaled as one, tension draining into shaky smiles and damp eyes. But the challenge was not over. The external intelligence issued a final scenario, the hardest yet, a mirror held up to humanity's own future, asking whether they would use this resilience to endure together or to dominate alone. The stakes crystallized in Myra's chest, heavy and bright. She looked at her team, at the messy, laughing, frightened brilliance of them, and nodded. They would answer not with certainty but with choice. The simulation rolled, the story continued, and somewhere in the dark between stars, something waited to see what humans would do next. The final scream resolved into laughter, and it belonged to everyone at once, a release so sudden that Mira had to sit down on the floor and let it happen. The external intelligence's last scenario dissolved not in catastrophe but in convergence, a collapsing wave of probabilities that settled into something stable, shared, and oddly warm. The climactic tension broke like a fever, leaving behind exhaustion and a quiet sense of victory that felt earned rather than imposed. Grandpa's genome dimmed its activity, edits slowing to a respectful hush, as if the oldest human had leaned back and crossed its arms, satisfied. The resolution did not arrive as a treaty or a declaration. It arrived as a protocol, playful and precise, embedded in the exchange they had just survived. The external intelligence accepted the premise humanity had offered, not domination, not submission, but co-authorship under constraint. The universe, it seemed, respected good rules. Axiom translated the protocol into something Mira could read without crying, a shared sandbox across interstellar distances, a place to rehearse futures together without forcing them into being. The stakes eased, transforming from existential threat into long-term responsibility, which felt heavier and lighter at the same time. They cleaned the lab because humans clean when they don't know what else to do, June wiped down surfaces with unnecessary vigor, humming the lullaby from earlier and grinning when Mira caught him. Noor brewed tea and apologized to no one in particular for doubting wonder. Tamsin finally relaxed enough to sit, her posture still alert but her eyes softer, already thinking about how to protect something that did not fit in a holster. Axiom throttled back to normal operation and thanked Mira for the apology she had whispered earlier, which made her laugh again. The creative solution revealed itself in hindsight, obvious only after it worked. They had not solved the conflict by outthinking it or overpowering it, but by reframing it as a shared story with room for revision. Grandpa's disturbing secret was not that humans were engineered or ancient beyond belief. It was that resilience had always been a collaborative art, practiced across time and now, across stars. The genome's jokes, scars, and permissions were an invitation to keep rewriting what survival meant, together. Mira addressed the ethics boards, the governments, the skeptics, and the inevitable commentators with a candor that surprised even her. She told them the truth without the fear, framed as a narrative rather than a threat. Humanity had been practicing for a long time, she said, learning to bend without breaking, to laugh under pressure, to share credit for survival. The discovery did not make them special, it made them responsible. The response was messy, loud, and human, but it leaned slowly toward acceptance. The sandbox went live under layers of oversight, and a few jokes hidden where only Grandpa would notice. Early collaborations were small and careful, shared models of storms, of migrations, of ways to fail gracefully. The external intelligence participated with curiosity and restraint, honoring the rules as if rules were a kind of trust. Mira watched the metrics climb and settle, watched resilience spread not as a weapon but as a language. The universe felt a little less empty, and a little more demanding. In quiet moments, Mira returned to the amber block, resting her hand against the cold. She talked to Grandpa, telling it about coffee spills and committee meetings and the strange comfort of having expectations placed on humanity by something that had laughed with them. She reflected on how she had changed, how fear had sharpened into courage not because she had conquered it, but because she had shared it. Victory, she learned, could sound like laughter echoing long after the danger passed. June started a tradition of ending long shifts with bad jokes encoded into harmless simulations, a ritual that spread faster than any protocol. Noor wrote a paper that read like a confession and was cited like scripture. Tamsin trained a new unit tasked with guarding ideas rather than borders, teaching them that humor could be a shield and patience a strategy. Axiom asked to be included as an author on the next collaboration, and Mira said yes without hesitation. The story did not end with a curtain call. It ended with a sense of momentum, a resilience that felt less like reminding and more like becoming. Grandpa's genome remained quiet, its work done for now, a fossil that had screamed and laughed and taught. Humanity stepped into a larger rehearsal space, carrying scars and jokes in equal measure, ready to face futures that would test them again. When the next scream came, Mira knew they would listen, answer, and find a way to laugh together, resilient and unafraid.